They told Caleb to take his little brother and leave before dark. No shouting, no long arguments. Their uncle just stood near the door, with tired eyes, and said the words Caleb would remember for the rest of his life. "I can barely take care of myself." That was it. An old backpack, 2 thin blankets, half a loaf of bread, and 7-year-old Jonah silently gripping Caleb's sleeve as they walked away from the only place that had ever felt like home. The cold was already creeping between the pine trees when they reached the old logging road. Jonah stumbled along behind, his small legs struggling to keep up. "Caleb, how much further?" Caleb looked ahead into the endless forest. Truth was, he didn't know anymore, but he couldn't let Jonah hear that. "Far enough," he said quietly. "Far enough that no one can send us away again." The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. No cars, no lights, just the sound of wet boots on mud and the wind hissing through the enormous pines above. Then Jonah suddenly stopped. Caleb turned immediately. His brother's lips were pale from the cold. "I'm tired." In one terrifying moment, Caleb realized something. If they didn't find shelter soon, Jonah might not survive the night out here. So he pulled the younger boy closer and kept moving. That's when he noticed the fence. Old wooden posts buried under weeds and moss, nearly swallowed by the forest. Caleb slowed down. Beyond the fence, hidden deep among the pines, was a small abandoned house. The roof had collapsed heavily on one side. One window was broken. Vines crawled up the walls, as if the forest had been trying to reclaim this place for years. Jonah stared silently. "Do you think someone lives there?" Caleb didn't answer right away, because beside the little house, beneath the tall weeds, he noticed something else. Straight, old garden rows. Someone had grown things there once, and suddenly this place didn't feel abandoned anymore. It felt left behind. Caleb pushed the old cabin door open with his shoulder. Wood scraped loudly across the floor as it swung inward. A cold, dusty draft rushed out from the darkness inside. Jonah stood close behind him. For a moment, neither moved. The cabin was tiny, just one room, and a narrow kitchen corner near the back wall. Everything smelled of old wood, cold ash, and years of silence. A small iron stove sat near the middle of the room. Caleb's eyes locked onto it immediately. Not broken, just old. That alone felt like luck. Moonlight filtered through the cracks in the walls, revealing faded blankets on a chair, empty shelves, and a rusted lantern hanging by the window. Jonah whispered, "Someone really lived here once." Caleb stepped carefully deeper inside, each floorboard groaning beneath him. Then he saw something that made him stop. Near the stove was a small pile of firewood, already chopped, dry, sheltered from the rain. Not much, but enough for one night. Caleb quickly knelt beside the stove and tried striking an old match he found in a tin box near the wall. The first match fizzled out. The second died immediately. Jonah curled up under one of the dusty blankets, shivering harder now. Caleb looked at him, then back at the cold stove. If he couldn't get a fire going, the night would turn dangerous fast. He struck the third match. This time, the flame caught. A few moments later, weak orange light flickered inside the little cabin for the first time in years. Jonah slowly lifted his head toward the warmth. And outside, beyond the dark window frame, the pine forest faded into the night. By morning, the fire in the little cabin had almost gone cold. Gray light seeped through the pine canopy outside, while Caleb quietly stepped onto the porch, studying the forgotten garden more closely. Weeds grew nearly to his knees, but beneath them, the old garden beds were still visible. Someone had worked hard here. Jonah shuffled out beside Caleb, kicking wet leaves with his boots. Then suddenly he stopped. "Caleb, listen." At first Caleb heard only the wind. Then, very faintly, water. Not rain, not dripping from the trees, but flowing water. Both boys followed the sound behind the little cabin until they found a patch of ground hidden beneath tangled roots and moss-covered planks. Caleb carefully pushed the rotten board aside. Beneath it was a narrow cellar door built into the earth. The hinges groaned as he opened it. Cold air rushed up from the darkness below. Jonah gripped his sleeve nervously. What if someone's down there? Caleb swallowed but climbed down first. The underground room was small, built of old stone walls. Wooden shelves lined both sides, mostly empty now, just a few dusty jars, and some potatoes too rotten to eat. But at the far end of the cellar, water flowed silently from the rock itself into a shallow basin. Clear, cold, constant. For the first time since leaving home, Caleb felt something in his chest loosen just a little. Water. Real water. Jonah stared at the spring with wide eyes. We're not going to die out here, are we? Caleb looked up at the little cabin above them. The old garden, the flowing spring, then finally answered, not if I can help it. The next several days revolved around one thing, surviving. Every morning, Caleb disappeared into the pine forest before sunrise with the old axe he'd found against the cabin wall. He chopped fallen branches, gathered dry wood hidden beneath dense thickets, and carried it all back before the cold afternoon rain arrived. Jonah stayed near the cabin. At first Caleb hated leaving him alone, but gradually, the boy began helping too, wiping out old jars in the kitchen corner, sorting dried beans they found in a rusty tin, gathering pine needles and grass to insulate the gaps beneath the door. Small things, but they mattered. One afternoon, Caleb followed the sound of water farther down the slope from the spring and discovered a narrow stream hidden between rocks. That night, he returned with 2 tiny fish wrapped in his jacket. Jonah's eyes went wide. You caught those? Caleb nodded tiredly. They slowly cooked the fish over the stove with wild onions Caleb had dug from the edge of the forgotten garden. The smell filled the little cabin within minutes. For the first time in days, this place smelled like someone lived here. That night, Jonah sat near the fire, eating quietly beneath his blanket. Outside, the cold wind swept through the endless pines. But inside the forgotten little cabin, the darkness no longer felt as frightening as before. Then the next morning, while exploring beyond the old fence, Caleb noticed something strange down the hillside. Dozens of apple trees. He followed the rows of trees down the slope until the forest suddenly opened into a forgotten orchard. Ancient apple trees stretched in crooked lines across the clearing, wild and overgrown, after years without care. Most of the apples had fallen and rotted, but not all. A few still hung high among the tangled branches, small and red in the cold autumn light. Caleb gathered as many as he could fit into his jacket. Near the far edge of the orchard, he found something even better, a massive walnut tree. The ground beneath it was littered with cracked shells hidden under fallen leaves. Real food, the kind of food that could last through winter. When Caleb returned to the cabin, Jonah almost smiled for the first time since they'd entered the forest. That evening, they roasted apples beside the stove, while walnuts dried near the firewood. The little cabin slowly grew warmer, more alive. The next morning, Caleb searched more carefully around the orchard and found a few old tools buried under a collapsed woodshed, a shovel, a rusted rake, an old lantern still hanging on a nail. Someone had once farmed this land seriously. Then, as he carried the tools back up the slope, Caleb suddenly stopped. Fresh mud stretched near the broken fence beside the cabin, and in it, almost invisible beneath fallen pine needles, were footprints. Human footprints. That night Caleb didn't mention the footprints. He just checked the trees around the cabin twice, before locking the old door with a piece of wire. Then he worked harder than ever. The weather was getting colder every day. Each morning was preparation for winter. Caleb patched the holes in the cabin roof with old boards from the collapsed shed. He stacked firewood against the wall beneath a tarp made from torn feed sacks. Jonah helped clear the forgotten garden bed by bed. Together they planted the last of the potatoes they'd saved before the ground froze completely. Near the porch, Caleb built a rain catchment barrel from an old metal drum, connecting it beneath the roof gutter. Slowly, the forgotten place began to change. Smoke rose from the chimney almost every night. Warm light appeared behind the dusty windows after dark. And for the first time in years, the little cabin no longer looked abandoned. One cold afternoon, while repairing loose boards near the kitchen wall, Caleb accidentally knocked something loose from within the wood. An old envelope, folded and yellowed, fell to the floor. Someone had hidden it there long ago. That night, Caleb carefully opened the old envelope by the stove, while Jonah watched quietly from beneath his blanket. The paper inside was thin and worn with age. Some parts had faded, but most was still readable. The letter came from the old man who had once lived alone in that little cabin. He wrote about the pine forest, the garden, and the winters that grew harder after his wife passed away. Then near the end of the letter, one sentence made Caleb stop reading for a moment. If anyone ever finds this place, survive better than I did. The cabin felt quieter after that. Jonah looked around the small room differently now, not with fear, but almost with respect, as if they were borrowing someone's unfinished life. The next morning, heavy gray clouds rolled across the forest. The wind rattled the pine tops harder than before. Caleb stepped outside, carrying more firewood, just as the first snowflakes began to fall. Winter had come earlier than he'd expected. The storm lasted nearly 2 days. Snow completely buried the old logging road, and the bitter wind shook the little cabin, so hard that Jonah sometimes woke with a start beneath his blankets. But the cabin held. The roof Caleb had repaired didn't collapse. The fire kept burning, and slowly, the storm moved deeper into the mountains. On the third morning, sunlight quietly filtered through the pine branches. Caleb stepped outside, axe in hand, and paused for a moment on the fresh snow. Smoke rose slowly from the chimney behind him. The abandoned cabin no longer looked forgotten. Firewood was stacked neatly beside the porch. The garden beds had been cleared before winter, and near the fence, small animal tracks marked the snow, where the forest had begun to accept them as part of itself. Jonah pushed the door open and stepped out, carefully holding 2 warm metal cups. "Hot water," he said proudly. Caleb smiled softly and sat down beside him on the frozen step. For a long time, they were both silent. The forest felt still now, no longer lonely. Peaceful. Then Jonah looked up at his brother and asked quietly, "Do you think we're still lost?" Caleb gazed out at the endless pines, at the little cabin, with smoke rising into the crisp morning air. Then he shook his head. "No," he said softly. "I think we finally found where we belong." They told Caleb to take his brother and leave before dark. No money, no food, nowhere left to go. Everyone thought the forest had taken everything from them. But deep in the pine woods, the 2 brothers built a life from the very things the world had thrown away. And sometimes, the smallest, most forgotten places are exactly where we find salvation. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments. Could you survive a winter in a tiny cabin in the woods? And what would you build first to make it a home? If you love quiet survival stories, hidden shelters, rebuilding from nothing, and emotional journeys like this one, subscribe and watch for our next story. And tell me honestly, what kind of mysterious place should the next story explore? An abandoned factory? A forgotten mountain cabin? Or maybe a tiny house tucked beside a frozen lake? I read every comment.